So moving on then in Kant to finish up chapter 2 of the Analytical principles, just to stand back a bit and synopsize, we have our table of principles, which corresponds to the axioms of intuition, whereby an object has extensive magnitude, and anticipations of perception, whereby an object will have intensive magnitude, and those are the mathematical rules, or the mathematical principles for the construction of objects. Then we have their regulative function. We put them in a cosmology, basically in relationship to other objects, which is what we have in the analogies of experience, where the object is a substance that has accidents, and those accidents are subject to, those accidents have alterations that are subject to the law of cause and effect, and they are also in relationship to other things, other objects, in reciprocity, with a thoroughgoing reciprocity. So we've constructed our object, we've put our possible object into relationship with other objects, so we've constructed a natural science picture, and now for the fourth of these we have postulates of empirical thought in general, which differs from these other three, and then it doesn't really increase our concept of the thing involved at all. It simply relates to the modality of the thing, whether the thing so constructed will be either a possible thing, an actual thing, or a necessary thing. And there are three different conditions for each of those. So, in order for the concept of the object that we have to be a possible thing, it has to agree with the formal conditions of experience, that is to say, as he puts it, with the conditions of intuition and of concepts, in order for it to be a possible object. And so we can't just come up with any concept. Let's say I come up with the concept of a centaur. Now we know that centaurs don't exist, but then the question becomes, why is it not a possible object? And Kant says it's not a possible object because, even though he uses other examples here, it's not a possible object because any object, in order for it to have the modality of possibility, has to meet with the formal conditions for the possibility of experience of an object in general. That is to say, it has to be something that we could encounter in space and time, and something that has to be subject to the law of causality and thoroughgoing reciprocity with other objects. And if it violates those conditions, then it's not a possible object. And he gives a couple of examples of what Deleuze would call impossible objects. When he talks about, we could imagine a substance in space that does not fill space. Or we could imagine the possibility of a person who has clairvoyance of the future. Kant obviously did not believe that there was any such thing as clairvoyance. Or that we would have a community of men in thoroughgoing communication with each other, no matter how far distant over the earth they were, which I take it by that he means telepathy, but note that precisely that thing that he says here is not possible is just about to happen 6 or 7 decades later with the invention of the telephone, which will indeed materialize telepathy by indeed making it possible for men who are far distant from each other to be in thoroughgoing communication. So we always need to be careful when a philosopher tells us that something's not possible, because sure enough, no sooner does he utter it than right around the corner science comes along and makes it an actuality. But he says that in order for something to be possible, then it has to meet the conditions of the possibility of experience in general, and it can't violate those conditions, otherwise it's not a possible object. But he really has in mind here the possibility of trying to do things like prove the existence of God. God is not a possible object of any experience, and so is not a proper subject for science, because God transcends the bounds of any possibility of experience. And it isn't that Kant doesn't believe in God here. He certainly does. He wants to keep science out of metaphysics and metaphysics out of science. Metaphysics requires belief and faith, not scientific proof. You cannot scientifically prove the existence of God. That's something that violates the rules of the game. Then he goes on to talk about the second postulate, which is that which is bound up with the material conditions of experience, that is, with sensation, is actual. So in order for the object that we have in front of us here to be an actual object, there always has to be some kind of sensory content. There has to be actual sensation of it in order for it to be an actual object. Otherwise, it isn't an actual object without a sensory correlate. And he inserts at this point in the narrative his refutation of idealism, and he has in mind here primarily the idealism of Descartes on the one hand and Berkeley on the other. Berkeley he dispenses with easily because Berkeley's idea that the world is a dream, basically, which is more or less what he says, that the world is for anything to be, is for it to be perceived, and that our perception of things is the only existence there is, and of course God does all the perceiving for us. It's basically an Irish version of Hindu metaphysics, and Kant dispenses with it by saying that it presupposes that space is a thing in itself, and that doesn't work at all. That kind of idealism can be dispensed with as a mere fantasy. But it's really the Cartesian brand of idealism that he wants to refute here when he says that Descartes' idea of idealism is that the outer world is something that is brought into question. The only thing that he can be certain of is, of course, his self-consciousness, the I am. That's the only thing that Descartes is absolutely certain of. And then he goes on from that to infer the existence of the outer world immediately as something secondary. But Kant then inserts this proof here, which I think is a rather strange and curious proof, and the weakest one of the book so far, that attempts to refute idealism by proving the existence of the outer world based upon, he says that the outer world is not something as Descartes has it, it's immediately given, it's immediately given. And he says that, for example, the proof is basically as follows, that because I know myself, I can know myself, I am in time. I know myself insofar as I am in time. Time is the form of the inner sense. But in my inner perception of myself, I don't have anything that corresponds to the category of permanence. The permanence is found only in the outer world. It's the category, the a priori category, as we have already seen, of substance. And that is found only in the outer world. And so I can't measure my inner determination of time except by reference to the permanent. And the permanent isn't found in my intuition. It's found in the outer world. Therefore, the things exist actually, really, in the outer world precisely because they determine the form of time that gives me the sense of certainty of my own knowledge of myself as existence. I can separate consciousness of myself, the I am, from knowledge of myself, but intuitions have to be given for it to be pragmatic knowledge of myself. But it's the fact that there is something permanent, namely substance, that's only found in the outer world that guarantees that I have time as the form of an inner sense here. So it's basically a fancy way of saying that the outer world exists because the subject exists and vice versa. I think it's a circular argument, and I think it undermines everything that he's been trying to do, which is to say that the mind brings with it the laws that make sense out of phenomena. He's not denying the existence of the outer world, but he is saying that we can't ever know it as it is in and of itself. But here he has a proof for the outer world, basically by saying that the outer world as object rubs up against myself as subject, and that friction generates the I am, the sense of self, the inner sense of time. And I find it to be a funny and curious and not very convincing proof. I think other philosophers have critiqued it as well. Then he moves on to finish his discussion of the postulates by talking about necessity, in which he says, that which in its connection with the actual is determined in accordance with universal conditions of experience is necessary. And so that, of course, has to do, those things are necessary that are a priori, that have a priori universality and necessity about them, and the mind brings that with it to experience. Necessity is not something that we see in the outer world. It's there in the mind, and necessity is then the object has to agree with the formal conditions by means of which it could not have been otherwise. And so he finishes up then his diagram of any possible object, not the transcendental object X that lies forever beyond the bounds of experience, but the possible object. And that's all he's concerned with in this chapter, is the experience of a possible object. So it has to be, it has to have extensive magnitude. Intensive magnitude is having a degree of sensation. It has to be a substance with accidents, a permanent subject over which all alterations take place that are in conformity with the necessity provided by the mind in the law of causality that organizes phenomena, so that they're subject to a rule, and they're in thoroughgoing reciprocity with each other to form a world picture, basically a natural scientific world picture, from which, be it noted, all other structures of consciousness, in his dismissal of clairvoyance, for example, such as the magical consciousness structure, need not apply. And it has to be either a possible object, or an actual object, or a necessary object that's in question. And that will have a bearing, that the modalities will have a bearing on his discussion of the abuses of metaphysics, such as trying to prove the existence of God using these kinds of principles. God is something, as is the soul, which forever transcends the bounds of a possible experience, and therefore we can't say anything with certainty about it, and we also cannot negate it with any kind of certainty, since it's forever outside the bounds of a possible scientific object. The soul, whether the universe had a beginning in time or did not have a beginning in time, those are forever outside the bounds of a possibility of experience. And it's not as though Kant is being a positivist here. He is a religious man. He's not being a positivist. He believes in the reality of the spirit world, but he wants to keep it out of science. He wants to keep science out of metaphysics, and this is a means of drawing a division between them. And so in the next chapter, we'll look at the grounds for his distinction of the world into phenomena, phenomenal display set up and organized by the mind, and noumena, the world of spiritual ideas.